Okay, so we are going to go over just the practice um, for exam one. And that should kind of go over all the material. My suggestion when you're watching this is to, if I'm going too fast or you're not understanding anything, just pause um, so you can get caught up and just like that's the beauty of a recorded video, right? Is that you can pause so you can like understand things. So it's not, I'm not just, if I'm speeding through things, you're not super confused. Um, and then I would take notes and do these problems with me. That way you're fully getting it. And again, just pause it if you need, if I'm going too fast. Um, and then do you remember how we talked about having like a separate piece of paper with formulas or, um, different things that would just help you like spark your memory if you're doing a problem, being like, oh yeah, that's how I need to do that. So I would, let's try and start making that. So I would have a separate piece of paper with, if I'm doing things and you're like, that's going to be important for me to remember, write that separately on a piece of paper. Um, and then last thing, if I'm doing a problem and um, you're just not sure how I'm getting somewhere or have any questions, take note of it so we can go over it tomorrow. And then if there's anything that like you understood how I did it, but you feel like you need lots of practice, also make a note because I can give you practice problems where you can just practice those things a lot. Okay, so we're gonna skip around because this exam doesn't go in the best order. So we'll come back to this first one. Um, and we're gonna start here at question 2. And well, sorry. I'm gonna leave it. I think we have enough room. Okay, so we have these two functions, okay? I've got my f of x equals this, and I have my g of x equals this. So for this first one, this is kind of what we are doing, what we've learned recently, but not as complicated. So they want to know what f of 2 plus g of negative 2. Oh, they're both negative 2, sorry. So first we're going to deal with f of negative 2. So for these problems, that's going to be the thing to do, is to find this one and then find this one. And then at the end, we'll add them together. So you know how to do this. I know you do. I always think about it. If I'm looking at f of x and I'm trying to find f of negative 2, my x right here is being replaced by negative 2, right? So what it's asking is when x is negative 2. So that's how I think about it, but you can just think of it as I'm replacing all of these x's. So I've got negative 2 squared plus 7 times 2 minus 3. So right here I've got negative 2 squared, which is a positive 4, but then I've got this negative still on the outside. So it's going to be negative 4 plus 14 minus 3. Which then this is going to be positive 10 minus 3, which is 7. So that equals my f of 2. Now I'm going to find g of negative 2. So remember, this g tells me I'm dealing with this function, my g function. And then I'm just replacing my x's with negative 2. And remember, I want to get stuck on these arithmetic. I would just put it in your calculator. So I've got negative 6 plus 11, which is, I don't have my calculator on me, 5, positive 5, which is my g of 2. So now I'm just going to go 7 plus 5, which equals 12, which is the answer. right? Because what they wanted is f of -2 plus g of -2. So now I just replace these with my answers. Okay, for this one, we're doing the same thing. So first I'm going to find f of 1, and then I'll find g of 1, and then we'll divide them together. So for this one, same thing, -1 squared plus 7 times 1 minus 3. 1 squared is a positive 1, but then I've got negative on the outside, so it's -1 plus 7 minus 3, which is 6 minus 3, which is 3. And then my g of 1 is just 3 times 1 plus 11, which is 3 plus 11, which is 14. And now they just want me to divide it, so I'm just going to replace them. So my f of 1 is 3, and my g of 1 is 14. So that's my answer. Okay, so for this next one, they want to know the absolute value. I'm just going to write this below. We're just solving this equation, and this is just dealing with the absolute value. So the big thing with absolute values is what I'm doing to solve this. I'm going to take away the absolute values. So I'll just have 3x minus 7 equals 11. Or 3x minus 7, so still no absolute values, equals -11. The reason why is that these absolute values turns everything from a negative to a positive. It changes everything positive. So in here, I could end up with a -11, but then the absolute values will make it positive. If that doesn't make sense, it's fine. So just remember that when you're solving for absolute values, you are going to set it equal to positive, the positive answer, and then set it equal to negative. And then all we're doing from here is we're just solving it. So for this side, I'm just going plus 7. Well, I'm going to do them at the same time. And then plus 7. So then over here, I've got 3x. I'm going to use my calculator so I don't have any stupid errors. Equals 18. And I've got 3x equals -4. Now, I'm going to divide by 3 and divide by 3. It's probably easier if you do them separate rather than what I'm doing, but just for the sake of time. So we have x equals 6 and x equals -4/3. And this should be an and, not an or. So that's my answer. My answer will be x equals 6 and -4/3. Okay, so this is something that, like in your notes, I don't know if you want to write, like when you have the absolute value, you need to set it to a positive and then to a negative, maybe more neatly, but something that helps you remember that that's what you're doing when you're dealing with absolute values. Okay. So this right here wants us to graph this function. It says make a table of values with at least 5 points and graph the function. So when it specifically wants you to make a graph, make a table, that's what I would do to make it, to graph this. So it says we need at least 5 points, so at least 5 x values. So all you're doing is you're choosing 5 random x values. I always like to do 0 and negative and positive 1. it doesn't matter, but I always like to do 0 and then do some positive and some negatives. And then I'm gonna do like -5 and +5. I just like, it's just a personal thing for me. I just like to have it some positives, some negatives, so you can see both sides. So now all I'm doing is for this -5, I'm just plugging it in for x, because I'm saying -5 minus 3 absolute value minus 2. Now, -5 minus 3 is -8. So the absolute value of -8 minus 2. And the absolute value of -8 is just +8 minus 2. I should have written this somewhere else. So that is 6. So I'm going to go ahead and graph that point right now. So when x is -5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, my y is 6. So about right there. Dang it. Okay, I think that's right. So now I'm just doing the same thing with all of these. So for -1, I just have -1 minus 3, oops, minus 2. And always when you're doing absolute values, you always need to do the stuff in the absolute values first. So I'm going to go -1 minus 3, which is absolute value of -4, minus 2. The absolute value of -4, it just changes it to a positive. So I just have 4 minus 2, which is 2. So when x is -1, my y is 2. So right there. And now for 0. So I've got 0 minus 3 minus 2. 0 minus 3 is just a -3. So I have absolute value of -3 minus 2. And then absolute value of -3, it just changes it to a positive. So I just have 3 minus 2, which is 1. So when my x is 0, my y is 1. Now I go here. So I plug in 1. So I have 1 minus 3 minus 2. 1 minus 3 is -2. And then minus 2, sorry, thinking. And then I've got, so the absolute value of -2 is just the positive, minus 2, which is 0. So my x is 1, my y is 0. So right there. And then last one, 5. So I've got 5 minus 3 minus 2. 5 minus 3 is just 2. So absolute value 2 minus 2. So the absolute value always makes it positive. It doesn't change the sign. So I've already got a positive, so I don't do anything. It's just 2. So absolute value of +2 is just +2 minus 2 equals 0. Interesting. I think I messed up somewhere. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 0. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so this is what they did. So I gotta see where I messed up. 0 minus 3. So 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 should be 0. Oh, wow, that's right. Okay. Okay, so absolute values are going to look like this. They're going to be a V shape, which is kind of why I thought I messed up. So here's going to be the trick with this, is to make sure this sign that's inside the absolute values. So I've got that -3. So I'm going to do the point +3. I'm going to make sure that's a point on my graph. So what it's going to be 3 minus 3 minus 2, which is 0 minus 2, which is -2. So I'll have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So the reason you want to always do this point is because that is where this V shape will be. So then here's my graph, like that. Here's the reality though. What we did here wasn't wrong. It just doesn't give us our full view of the graph. Does that make sense? Like those points that I plotted weren't wrong, but we were just getting a funny shape and not a V shape. So what you can also do is graph it in your calculator. So when you graph this in your calculator, well, I just grab your calculator and do this with me. So you go to the y equals, just like you normally do. Now to get the absolute values is the tricky part. It's not tricky, but you just need to remember how to do it. So you are in the y equals place, clear anything out that's already in there. And now you're gonna click on math, which is just below, you see the blue and green button, it's just below that. And then you're gonna go over to the NUM. And then it's the first one, that ABS with a parenthesis, that's absolute value. So just go to that, click enter, and that's your absolute value sign. So now you're just gonna plug in x minus 3, and then just close the parenthesis, and then just the -2. And when you do that, you can see the graph. So that way, if you're doing the 5 points and you're realizing it's looking weird, you can graph it and try to figure out what point is this the end of the V, because that's what, when you're graphing an absolute value function, you're going to want that endpoint and then like 2 others, so you can kind of get the general direction. But again, it's not a, yeah, that's why you got your calculator. It's not a huge deal if you did what I did and are all confused about how to do it. Okay, let me skip around. Okay, let's do this one because we were dealing with absolute values. So it wants us to solve, oh, I lied. We're gonna not do that one quite yet. Let's do this one. Sorry, I keep changing my mind. They have this in no like order. Okay. Let's do this inequality. So if you remember solving inequalities, the big thing is that if I multiply or times by negative, I have to flip that sign. And the next thing is this and. We'll do another one right after this where it has or, and I'm going to explain in a second what it means by that. So I've got 2x plus 7 is less than 21. And then I've got 3x minus 1 greater or equal than -13. You were really good at these ones when we did that earlier. So hopefully you'll remember this and it will click. Okay, so for this 2x plus 7 is less than 21, I'm just solving this just like I would an equation. So I'm going to subtract 7. So I'm going to have 2x less than 14. And then I just divide by 2, divide by 2. So I have x is less than 7. Okay, so that's one of my answers. I'm going to go over to this one and just the same thing. I'm going to add 1, add 1. So I got negative 12 and 3x. And now I divide by 3, divide by 3. So I've got x is greater or equal than negative 4. Okay, so now I have these two things. Now, if you remember, we got to graph it. It wants it, it's asking us for graph it, but also it's just helpful to do it. So I have negative 4 and 7. So starting with this 7, this is a open circle. So this is something I might write in your notes. If I have this or this, my circle is open, and I have this or this, my circle is closed. So if it's greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, closed circle. If not, it's an open circle. And then if I have my x on the left-hand side, I just go whatever way my arrow is pointing. So for 7, it's pointing this way. Okay. For my negative 4, it's a closed circle, and my arrow is pointing this way. Okay. If you were to finish this equation and it would say negative 4 is less than or equal to x, then I can't look at which way the arrow is pointing. I need to have the x on the left-hand side. That's going to be something to remember. So to do that, just write the x on the left-hand side. And you see how this greater than, the bigger side, is kind of eating the x? You just got to make sure that that's the same. These two things are the exact same, okay? This one, it's pointing, I don't know, you can all look at it as either pointing to the negative 4 or opening up to the x, but you just got to make sure that's the same when you flip it and put the x on this side. So that will be important. Don't just get to this and say, oh, the arrow is pointing left, so it goes left. If you're going to look at which way it's pointing to graph it, then you need to make sure the x is on the left-hand side. Okay, so this is our graph. Now it wants us to write the solution using interval notation. So this is where this and is important. When it's saying and, it wants to know where it overlaps. Okay, so right here is where it overlaps, right? So this is going to be my solution. So to write it in interval notation, remember I start at the left, go to the right. So I have negative 4 and it's in a bracket because it's a closed circle. And I go all the way up to 7 and it's going to be a parenthesis because it's an open circle. That's my interval notation. Okay. So up here, you can just add, right, if it's an open circle, parentheses, closed circle, bracket. Okay, so that's how you do that problem. So now we're going to do this one, question 11. So same thing, but the only difference is that it has an or. And I'll explain at the end what that means. So first we're going to go ahead and graph it. So this is something, if you want to pause and solve these and then press play and see if you got the same solution, that is a great idea. So you're going to have 3x minus 1 is greater than 5. Negative 4x plus 5 is less than or equal to 8. Okay, so first I add 1. It's So I'm going to go through this fast. So if I go to it too fast, just pause, slow down, whatever you need. Then I divide by 3, divide by 3. So I have x is greater than 2. And now over here, I'm going to subtract 5. Subtract 5. So I have negative 4x is less than or equal than 3. And now I divide by negative 4. So remember, when I divide or multiply by negative 4, by a negative, it doesn't need to be negative 4. When I divide or multiply by a negative, I have to flip the sign. So now I'm going to have x, and I flip the sign, negative 3/4. Okay, so I realize is that both x's are on my left-hand side, so I don't need to flip them. So now just to graph, I got my line, got negative 3/4, got 2. My negative 3/4 is a closed circle. 2 is an open circle. And for 2, my arrow is pointing this way. For negative 3/4, my arrow is pointing this way also. And obviously this one goes past. They keep going, but I'm not going to write that. Okay, so now when it says or, they want kind of all the solutions. So before when it said and, we wanted to know where it overlaps. This time with or, we just want to know everything. So I'm just going to see where these arrows are. So if I start all the way down here at negative infinity, I don't get anything till I get to negative 3/4. That's a bracket because it's a closed circle. And then I just keep going. When I get to 2, I do have this open circle, but this line right here is going to cross it. So it's actually going to include 2. And then these lines just keep going on and on and on to infinity. So I just have comma infinity. And that's your answer. So this is just a note. If you were to graph something and you had it like this and like this, remember this would be, let's say this is 2 and 3. You would be negative infinity to 2, and then you use the union, which is saying and 3 to infinity. Okay? So there's that. Now, let me skip around. So sorry. Okay, we're gonna do those later. So for this one, let me make sure I'm right before I do it. Oops, so many things. Okay. That's good to know. I was not going to do that right. So when we're solving the absolute value of an inequality, it's going to be and you do the same thing. So I'm just going to rewrite it with the absolute values and keep the 3 positive. But then I got to flip the sign and have it be a negative. So let me go back and I'll explain it a little better. So remember, when this was an equal, if this was an equal sign, if it wasn't an inequality, if I just had 4x minus 5 equals 3, then I would have to write it the same without the absolute value and then write it again, having it equal negative 3. So for this, it's the same thing. So I've got 4x minus 5 is less than 3. And then I have and 4x minus 5, and I have a negative 3, and I have to flip the sign. Okay, so that's going to be the biggest thing with those absolute value inequalities. And this is something like on the note card, maybe if you just write this original one and then write the first step, That will help you know what you need to do. Or you could write it out in words, whatever you think. But this is an example of something that might be helpful to write down. Because if you see a problem like this, it can spark your memory and say, oh, this is my first step. From here, I know what to do. Okay, so now we're just gonna solve these. I'm gonna do it at the same time. If you wanna pause and do it yourself, and then let's see if we get the same answer, we totally can. I'm gonna work through it fast. And I'm gonna do both at the same time, which probably isn't a great idea, but. So over here, I've got 4x is less than 8. And over here, I've got 4x is greater than 2. Now, dividing by 2. Divide by 2. So I have x is less than 4. Oops. I divide by 4. Divide by 4, so I'd have x is less than 2. Then I divide by 4.